This week, another round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. They were a little later than we thought they were going to be, and there was limited progress to speak of. And after several weeks of what seemed like really positive momentum for President Zelensky on the diplomatic stage, his presidency has come under a whole new level of scrutiny this week over these controversial changes he's made to domestic anti-corruption bodies. We saw thousands of people out on the streets right across Ukraine. The EU also voicing its concern. So we'll be asking, could this compromise Ukraine's coalition of support, just as Kyiv has managed to persuade the US to continue arming its defence via NATO? We'll be answering all your questions on that and more with our expert panel.
Hello, I'm Lyse Doucet.
And in Moscow, I'm Steve Rosenberg.
And I'm Lucy Hockings. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
We're going to get our audience questions in a moment, but first, as I've been saying, it's been a really big week of news, and I've been getting up to speed with Vitaly. He's at an airport in Istanbul on his way back from reporting on that latest round of talks. Hi Vitaly, you're in Istanbul airport, one of the nicer or better airports to be talking to us from, particularly when it's hot. It's kind of space age, isn't it, Istanbul airport? But you're there for the talks again. Wasn't there some confusion as to whether they would even take place?
As always, Lucy, until the very last moment, I had no idea when I'll be going to Istanbul, when the talks will be happening. It all started with the Kremlin last week accusing Ukraine of delaying the process. They're saying, look, we're ready to talk, let's talk. Where is Ukraine? Why don't you come and sit down at the table with us? To which President Zelensky responded by saying last Monday, okay, we're ready to talk. Let's meet on Wednesday. And then the Kremlin kept saying, we'll let you know if we're coming, when we know it. Just watch this space. And frankly, we went to Istanbul just in case something happened, because the indications were that something was afoot and they would be coming. And they did. And I'm glad that we were there, prepared. And I got a sense of deja vu, Lucy. The same venue, Chiran Palace on the banks of the Bosphorus, the same delegations, well, led by the same people. Vladimir Medinsky for Russia, the presidential advisor, who once said that Russians had an extra chromosome, and Rustem Umerov for Ukraine, until last week, defense minister. Now he is secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, and also same demands, same positions put forward by Ukraine and Russia. So there was very, very little reason to hope that this time around they'll sit down, thrash it out, and achieve a breakthrough. And they didn't.
Yeah, so the same positions, as you mentioned, no big breakthrough, Vitaly, but was anything agreed, anything new?
You know, when I was sitting at the news conference given by the Ukrainian delegation after the talks, and you had to choose, you couldn't go to both. One thing that struck me was that the Ukrainians, they prefer to speak about their quote unquote proposals. So they're saying that their objective is, primary objective is organizing a meeting between leaders, meaning Volodymyr Zelensky, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, they mentioned him as well, and possibly the Turkish President Erdogan, as well as a ceasefire. Have they agreed much? Well, not really. This was the shortest meeting of the three, lasting under an hour, I think 35 minutes or so. And this short meeting resulted in the smallest number of things that can be remotely called agreements. They said they'll probably set up working groups working remotely on this whole issue, humanitarian exchanges as well, meaning repatriation of dead bodies as well as prisoner exchanges, but nothing in terms of agreements on the key, fundamental, persisting issues. And it felt as though they didn't really have much to discuss because their positions, they're so far apart. It was never going to be a discussion, as in an exchange of opinions, arguments, and counter arguments. It was an opportunity to present demands once again, or proposals in quote marks. And that's
Vitaly,
what
you've,
happened.
Vitaly, you've been in Istanbul for a few days, but you've also been covering what is arguably the biggest story on Ukraine this week. And we have a question on it. Let's have a listen to this question from Joanna.
Hello, Ukrainecast. I'm interested to know what's going on in Ukraine with the anti-corruption initiative, which I know was a requirement of consideration for membership of the EU. I'm reading that there are some changes going on there, and I want to know if there's a reduction in commitment to the anti-corruption initiative. Thank you very much.
Vitaly, talk us through what it is that President Zelensky's actually changing here and why it's proved to be so hugely controversial.
Oh, it's big. It's really big, Lucy. Some people say it's a watershed, potentially a watershed moment in Ukraine's history. Let's rewind 10 years back when these two key anti-corruption agencies, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecution Service, were set up in Ukraine on the insistence of Ukraine's Western allies under their supervision, just for the purpose of tackling rampant corruption. They wanted it, they got it. Those agencies, they did a reasonably good job. They were independent. That was the key point. They were not controlled by politicians. They could do their job independently until last Tuesday, when Parliament very quickly, the bill was tabled in the morning. A few hours later, it was passed by Parliament, and in the evening, it was signed by Volodymyr Zelensky. That was really quick. So that bill subordinated those agencies to Ukraine's chief prosecutor, who is a Zelensky loyalist, and he will now be able to reassign anti-corruption probes and even close them. This triggered the biggest protests since the start of the full-scale invasion. I've been looking at posters held up by those demonstrators, and time and again they were making this point. This is why we ousted the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. This is what our husbands and brothers and fathers and other relatives and friends are fighting for on the front lines. It's not about territory, not only about territory, it's also about values such as the fight against corruption. And now the authority and independence of these two key institutions is being undermined. We don't like it. So that gives us an idea of why this is controversial. It's not just about a small tweak to law. It's a key change to how Ukraine fights corruption, how much power the presidency has, and also it runs the risk. It creates the risk of undermining support that Ukraine has been receiving for the past 10 years from its Western allies. And the social contracts that we saw emerge after the start of the full-scale invasion, where Ukrainians, well, they put their differences aside, put political differences aside, and they united around Zelensky for the time of the war, saying, we may not like him, but here's the president that we have. Let's help him fight Russia, and then we'll sort out all the other issues. Now that is under threat. So it's a huge issue for Vladimir Zelensky personally, for Ukraine as a state. And now I think he may be rowing back in his nightly address to the nation last night. He said he will table another bill to Parliament, which will make sure that these agencies remain independent and have the right sort of authority. But let's see what happens next.
Vitaly, it was amazing, wasn't it, to see that the protests were everywhere. It was so widespread. It wasn't just Kyiv. We were getting pictures and seeing protests in Odessa and Lviv right across the country. Why did President Zelensky, though, make this move in the first place? What can we read into the timing?
Well, his his supporters, the security service of Ukraine and the prosecutor general's office, are saying that these anti-corruption agencies have been infiltrated by Russian agents. That's why there have been searches and arrests, because the suspicion is that these agencies were influenced or controlled by Russia somehow. To which critics of the law say it's just an excuse, and anti-corruption investigators might have been getting closer to exposing corruption within President Zelensky's inner circle. Now, there's no evidence to support either of those claims or counterclaims, but all we know is that this is a huge blow to Ukraine and Ukrainians' aspirations of becoming a truly democratic and prosperous nation.
Vitaly, safe travels home. See you next week.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Vitaly. Well, Steve and Lyse are still here with us. We're going to stay with that question that Joanna asked us on the subject of those protests in Ukraine. And Lyse, the EU have been quite concerned about this move as well from President Zelensky. Is there any sense at all that President Zelensky could be losing some support from these key allies in Europe because of this?
Well, the most important thing is that they'll be keeping an eye on those protests and saying, well, what do the people of Ukraine think about what seems to be a move away from the kind of issues which are central to any hopes of Ukraine becoming part of the European Union, issues of transparency, accountability. Remember, the setting up of the Anti-Corruption Bureau came out of the protests in 2014, in which there did seem to be a very public expression of support for moving closer towards Europe. And Europe began thinking about that and saying, well, how do we prepare Ukraine? So yes, there was even a warning from the European Union saying that this would be watched very closely and that a lot of the aid to Ukraine was dependent on this process being seen to continue and not to backslide.
How are the protests being seen by the Kremlin, Steve?
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, what is happening in Ukraine now is a gift, right, to the Kremlin, because the official narrative here being put out by the Russian authorities is President Zelensky is illegitimate, Ukraine is not a democracy, so the Russian authorities can point to this, to what's happening, to kind of fuel the official narrative. On the other hand, it's a bit of a poisoned chalice, because the images that we've been seeing of huge crowds of people coming onto the streets in Ukraine, these images of people power, people demanding that anti-corruption institutions are independent of the authorities, people demanding that the government is brought to account. These are things that really the Russian authorities aren't really that keen on encouraging here in Russia. Moscow doesn't want to see huge crowds of people in Russia coming onto the streets to demand democracy, to demand a fight against corruption. It's for that reason that we've seen so many repressive laws passed, adopted in Russia over the last 3 years or so to prevent that kind of thing happening. So there are two sides to this. It was interesting. I was reading the coverage in the government paper, the Russian government paper today, and they cover the protests in Kiev, but they try to sort of discredit the protesters. So I've got the paper here. So, for example, they suggest that some of the protesters were hired by the former Ukrainian President Poroshenko, and they talk about the protesters as activists from the Euro-Atlantic NGOs, choosing words and phrases to try to undermine the protests. So it's a double-edged sword, I think, for the Kremlin.
And remember that President Trump, he hasn't mentioned it for a while, but after a telephone call with President Putin, he suddenly started talking about the importance of elections in Ukraine, raising the possibility that actually Ukraine should have a new leader, that he wasn't happy with President Zelensky. And this was very much please, of course, not just President Trump, but President Putin, who would like to see someone more pliant in Kiev. And it was noticeable, Steve mentioned the mention of Poroshenko. I saw Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev. He was also in the protests, and they've been so reticent because of Ukraine being under attack from Russia, not to give the impression of any important political splits and not trying to pose themselves as pretenders to the throne. But these kind of moments are moments where they will think, oh, okay, if President Zelensky's popularity is slipping, if this is an issue, here's a moment for me to perhaps make a little move.
EU officials have been commenting and saying in some cases this could be seen as a real step back. And as you've mentioned, Lyse, they're watching closely. But what about the US? You mentioned President Trump there. Everyone is sort of talking about the momentum that President Zelensky has had, that we're seeing signs of real progress there. Given the US has also expressed their concern over corruption in Ukraine, could this sort of damage that momentum in any way, do you think?
It's summer in the United States. Ukraine is not on the minds. It's not in the media very much anymore, sadly. Unless President Trump decides to make it an issue, to put it on the radar such that it becomes a talking point. We cover this week in, week out. Yes, President Trump is going to give arms and finance. No, he's not going to give. And you have this back and forth. So at the moment where President Trump wakes up and says, oh, I don't like giving all this money, this will feed into that.
Well, we've been hearing from Vitaly, who has been covering the peace talks in Istanbul. We have had a question from John. And John says, why do you keep referring to these meetings in Istanbul as peace talks? There is absolutely no possibility of any ceasefire coming from these talks. You must know, just as well as I do, that Putin has no interest in stopping the war in Ukraine temporarily or permanently. Steve, we'll get to the potential motives in a moment, but these talks do come off the back of that 50-day deadline set by Donald Trump for Russia to agree a ceasefire. What was the reaction to that? I mean, is the Kremlin taking that deadline seriously?
What is it they say, Lucy? 7 days is a long time in politics. Well, 50 days is a very, very long time. And I think that's the attitude of the Russians. I mean, 50 days, anything can happen in 50 days. I think the view from Moscow is that in 50 days, Donald Trump could change his mind completely. In 50 days, the Russians could come up with sort of counter proposals, counter ideas to put back to the White House and maybe kick the threat of these trade tariffs into the long grass. 50 days is also a long time for the Russians to continue their push into Ukraine and seize more Ukrainian territory. And I think for those reasons, the reaction from Russian officials has been quite muted, I'd say. The other thing is, just reading the Russian press and watching television here, there are many commentators who don't believe that Donald Trump would go ahead with these quote, bone-crushing sanctions, these 100% tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil and other Russian natural resources, because that would also damage the American economy too. So put all that together, and I think the Russians, yes, they do listen to what's happening. They listen to Donald Trump. They take things seriously, but they analyse his words, they analyse his actions, his behaviour, and for those reasons, I think far from everyone here in Moscow believes that these sanctions, these trade tariffs will actually be brought in.
Lyse, I remember when the first talks took place in Istanbul, you joined us on Ukrainecast, but you were in the Gulf with President Trump.
President Trump meeting very wealthy Gulf leaders.
But do you remember the media kind of fanfare around the talks in Istanbul? You were sort of thinking maybe you'd have to dash there and President Trump might.
Yes, President Trump floated this possibility.
There's so much speculation.
If they make progress, I'm going to. And the press, right to the last minute. Maybe Steve had his bags packed too in Moscow, that President Putin would join the talks if they made progress, that President Trump would, and that even right to the moment he got on the plane on the Friday.
But what about this time? How are these talks being viewed by the international community this time around, the ones we've had in the past few days?
I mean, the account of them is absolutely dreadful. Every time they make progress on prisoner exchanges, which is, of course, is a very good thing. But from the accounts that we've had, and Vitaly, of course, has seen it up close, poor Vitaly rushing there for hoping there's something and then rushing back because there was almost nothing. It lasted less than an hour. Russia continues to say it doesn't want a ceasefire. It only wants those very limited, for very specific periods. Even saying now that there doesn't need to be a meeting with President Putin until there's something to sign. I mean, just underlining that the humiliation for the Ukrainians, that they don't see this as being necessary. And it goes back to that point that President Trump has made, that the deal can only be done between President Trump and President Putin. And even that shows itself not to be possible.
Yeah, on that, Steve, this potential meeting that everyone's talking about between the leaders, there is some speculation when you look at the timing as well of the deadline that could happen, possibly in China, that we might see Putin, Trump, Xi all meeting together in China. What's the Kremlin saying about that?
Well, the Kremlin hasn't ruled that out. There has been a lot of chatter about that because that 50-day deadline expires, September the 2nd, I think it is. And Vladimir Putin will be in Beijing on a visit then. He's going to be attending a parade on September the 3rd, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II there. And we know that Donald Trump has said a few days ago that he's been invited to visit Beijing. He hasn't said when. So we don't know whether September the 2nd, September the 3rd, suddenly Putin and Trump will be in China at the same time. If only I could have a peek into their diaries and check this out. But we've kind of been there before, because I remember back in February, after the first Putin-Trump phone call, we all thought, oh my goodness, there's going to be a summit any day now in Saudi Arabia. And we started trying to accredit to go to Saudi Arabia for the summit. That never happened. Then there were rumors that Donald Trump was going to turn up in Moscow for the 9th of May for the Victory Day parade. That never happened. He didn't pop up in Istanbul either. So, yes, we're looking ahead to Beijing. Who knows what's going to happen, but who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, we've all got the 2nd and 3rd in our diaries at the
every
moment.
time we talk about this, I remember being, to use the diplomatic expression, I was shoulder to shoulder with Steve Rosenberg when we were in Helsinki that time that President Putin and President Trump met there. Oh.
John's question, though, Lyse, I mean, you've talked to many people about many conflicts for many years. When it comes to this kind of diplomacy, what's your take on this? I mean, is it worth even bothering when the two sides just don't agree, when it feels like almost the talks are being conducted in bad faith?
I've talked to mediators who are working on different aspects of the Russia-Ukraine relationship. And I remember from the very early days when after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russians and Ukrainians started speaking immediately. And that mediators said, wow, that doesn't usually happen, that while a war is in full flow, you actually sit down to talk. But then, of course, that was just, again, about prisoners, about talks. And then the question was posed then, well, maybe we can use these talks, which are more technical in nature, and we can use the confidence that's built up there to move on to political issues. So every year would go by and I'd ask the mediators when I'd meet them in different capitals, well, is there any progress? They say no, they're not moving beyond politics. And fast forward to where we are discussing today, is they've never moved an inch beyond the discussion of exchange of prisoners. Mediators always say it's good to talk, and that the past experience shows that once you stop talking, that the vacuum is filled with more fighting. This is not the case here. But I think the real issue here is in President Trump's world, nobody wants to be the one that is seen to try to end any possibility of a deal. So if President Zelensky said, I'm not sending my mediators anymore, it's a waste of time, that would provoke President Trump. He would say, see, he's not interested in a ceasefire. And similarly for the Russians, they all have to give the impression that they are interested in the process without actually giving an inch.
I wonder when you two are going to rub shoulders again then. Steve, good to see you in Moscow. Thank you. Lyse, lovely
Thanks very
to have
much.
you
I just want to say, if there is a summit, I'd love to be shoulder to shoulder again with Lyse Doucet.
Yeah, you'll both be sending in your accreditation and hoping to be together.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Steve. Lyse, thank you so much. Thanks for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. And if you want a longer version of this episode of Ukrainecast, you can find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts. And don't forget to click and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.